Well, hello once again, and welcome back to Classic Dirt Bike TV here on YouTube, where we continue to look at more of those old school vintage race bikes from our racing past. Now, a quick hello here to all the brand new subscribers who have recently signed up since my last video posting, so welcome aboard, and I hope you continue to enjoy future videos here on my channel. So next up, we're going to take a look at another iconic four-stroke machine from the late 1970s. Now, there was not many of these original bikes made back in the late 1970s, but this particular bike that we're going to look at here is a replica version of one of these iconic machines. So without any further delay, let's jump straight into the video and take a look at this 1977 HL 500 four-stroke Yamaha. Now, just before we get down to the actual story of the iconic HL 500 Yamaha, this featured bike here isn't of course an authentic HL Aberg 500 Yamaha, but is still a period correct imitation of one of those production HLs from the late 1970s. Now, original Aberg four-stroke Yamahas would have had the custom-built Profab chassis, Simon's forks on the front, and of course a set of Fox air shocks on the rear, although these production versions certainly did come with Öhlins rear shocks, Yamaha YZ forks on the front, and of course this four-stroke Yamaha 500cc motor. But back in the late 1970s, 500cc world champion Sten London and 250cc world champion Torsten Holman began working together to try and build a prototype twin-shock four-stroke race bike using a Husqvarna frame and an engine taken from the late 1970s trail bike, the Yamaha TT500. Now, it was then that Holman and London went to the USA-based Profab Engineering to get them to make a lightweight chrome moly chassis that London then mated to a custom-made alloy swing arm, which of course had state-of-the-art custom-made Fox air shocks on the rear, and of course, as I said, Simon's forks up front. And this brand new project they then named the HL 500 Yamaha, which naturally was titled using the first two letters of both Holman and London's surnames. Now, when the new bike was completed, it was an awesome collection of quality components, and the entire bike weighed in at around 247 pounds and gave the rider almost 11 inches of travel at both the front and rear of the bike. Now, sometime later, Torsten Holman then approached Yamaha about letting two-time world champion Bengt Aberg race one of the new HL Aberg Yamahas in the 1977 World Championship, but Yamaha refused, and so Torsten just went ahead and did it anyhow, to which Aberg took the brand new HL Yamaha to a 9th place finish overall that year, and he even won a race on the bike at a race event in Luxembourg. Now, if you were lucky enough and rich enough back in the 1970s, you might still be able to have got your hands on a genuine Aberg HL 500, although those bikes were really only offered as a kit machine in the USA, where Profab, it said, only built around 100 of the original Profab Aberg machines. And at that time, the basic chassis with the alloy swing arm and a couple of other bolt-ons would have set you back $1,000 in 1978. But of course, you then had to find the tank, the seat, the forks, the rear suspension, and naturally, of course, that big 500cc Yamaha motor with the rest of the accessories, so your completed machine was now heading for over $3,000, which was a huge amount of money in that particular year. But just to be clear, that our bike here is of course not one of those very rare Aberg HL Yamahas, and the chassis on this featured bike was built by Drayton Frames in the UK, who built all manner of motorcycle chassis, but they did tend to specialise in trials bike frames. Now, the motor on our featured bike here is a bored out Yamaha TT500 power plant, and this motor here is a 540cc unit that has an upgraded high lift race cam fitted, and this particular engine here was prepped and built by classic bike building expert Rod Spry, who of course specialises in building and restoring old vintage dirt bikes. But even in their stock form, these old TT500s were still very good motors, and they were hugely reliable as a trail bike engine. But when you started tuning these quite formidable four-strokers by fitting race cams and bigger valves and boring them out over size with larger pistons, they can certainly turn these quite mundane trail bike lumps into a fire-breathing monster. But as we take a look at the bike's exhaust system, now this again was a straight through big bore pipe that although it did have a tailpipe fitted at the rear, it didn't do much in terms of quietening the bike down much, but it certainly added to the fantastic grunt that came from this Drayton Racing manufactured tail cone. Now, these TT500 engines had a standard wet multi-plate clutch, and I wouldn't really be surprised if this motor here has had stronger clutch springs fitted to cope with the extra horses from that Yamaha motor. And as I recall, these old TTs also had a 5-speed gearbox as well, and the motor's oil filter is easily accessible for servicing by just removing this plate and those little 3 Allen screws to gain access. But I'm sure you know already that these 4-stroke TT500 motors had a dry sump whereby the oil for the engine was housed in the bike's frame front down tube, and it was then of course pumped around the important parts of the engine and then fed back into the frame through a small filler cap just ahead of the bike's fuel tank, much like the old lubrication systems that were fitted to many of the older British built vintage race bikes from back in the day. But overall, as I said, if you were looking for an engine to power your old crosser, then these big 4-banger Yamaha motors were certainly an excellent choice, because if you weren't happy with its power output and its stock trim, then there's so much that you can do to these motors to improve their overall performance, and there's plenty companies out there now who specialise in making these old TT500 power plants go faster. So there's certainly plenty scope for you to tune one of these engines to suit your own requirements. Now, if this bike here was a bona fide Aberg 500 Yamaha, it would have had a pair of American-made Simon's forks on the front of the bike, but in our case here, we have a set of forks that are taken straight from a YZ Yamaha 2-stroke bike, which is what would have been fitted to the production HL Yamahas of the late 1970s. And because our featured bike here was using the YZ Yamaha front forks, it naturally also used the YZ Yamaha hubs and brakes as well. And as you'd expect, these drum brakes had to work very much harder to slow down this heavier 4-stroke machine, as opposed to what would have been a lighter bike when these old school drum brakes were originally bolted onto the lighter YZ two-stroke machine. And also, to save precious weight on the bike, these brake backplates were made of magnesium. Now, once more, original HL Aberg Yamahas would have had a custom-made alloy swing arm, but this box section unit that we're looking at here is another Drayton product that's been custom made to fit onto their Drayton steel chassis. Now, if you ever needed help to identify what particular year of HL Aberg Yamaha you had back in the late 1970s, then the 1978 bike had a similar straight swing arm like our bike here, while of course the later 1979 model had the banana style swing arm, which had also been made of alloy. Now, once more, if you were the lucky owner of your very own original HL Yamaha in the late 1970s, then you would have had a state-of-the-art set of Fox air shocks on the back of the bike, although production versions of those Aberg Yamahas did certainly use these high-quality piggyback Öhlins shocks, which were almost identical to the ones seen here. So although this bike's not one of those rare famous Aberg Yamahas, it still has many of the parts that were used on the production versions. And again, these Öhlins units were top quality and of course fully serviceable. Now, one of the interesting features about these HL and Aberg Yamahas was that they did have a very small fuel tank, which was more than likely fitted to try and keep the overall weight of the bike to a minimum. And again, normally these fuel tanks were taken straight from the smaller Yamaha dirt bike range, like maybe the little YZ 125s, for example. And as far as I'm aware, these did store enough fuel to get that big, thirsty TT500 engine across the finish line. Now, the bike's seat again was fairly slim, and it didn't appear to have much in the way of padding, but then again, if you did want to ride one of these big HL Yamahas back in the day, you had to be reasonably tall in the leg department, as these machines were certainly not built for the short and stocky rider. Now, once again, pretty much of the bike's controls and cables, levers and throttle gasser will almost certainly have been taken straight from the Yamaha parts bins, as these replica production bikes certainly used much of Yamaha's stock items to put them together, although they were still very good quality and did their job perfectly. But as I said, in the late 1970s, original HL Aberg Yamahas are just so hard to come by these days, and if any actually do come onto the market, then they certainly sell for big money. And when you consider those original bikes back in the day would have cost you upwards of $3,000 in 1978, that'll maybe give you an indication of the kind of money that you would need to be able to buy one in this modern day. But then again, you could always sell your house to have enough to put a deposit down on one of the Aberg originals. But when Holman and London did come up with the idea of building the big HL four-stroke Yamaha, it certainly made a very big impact on the motocross world, which at that time was dominated by the big two-stroke bikes, and Holman and London took a pretty stock 500 four-stroke motor that was putting out just around the 30 horsepower mark in standard trim. But then, of course, they would work their magic with hot cams and a big bore kit, and they then had a world-beating motor that pushed out 50 plus horsepower. But who knows, maybe one of these days I'll maybe get a chance to film and photograph one of the original HL Aberg Yamahas. But until then, we'll have to just settle for this example here, which is a very similar bike to the production models that were on sale in the late 1970s, although our bike here has that Drayton frame and swing arm, but it still has that completely awesome TT 500 motor. Well, I hope you enjoyed that walk around that quite nice looking HL 500 Yamaha Fourstroke replica. Not of course an original Aberg Yamaha from back in the day, as I said, very few of those original bikes were actually made, but it's nice to take a look at one of these replica versions of those iconic machines. So coming up next time, we're going to go back to the Rob Hughes classic dirt bike collection, and the next time round we'll be taking a look at this lovely pair of CCM bikes from the late 1980s, and that particular number 10 bike that you can see there is Greg Hansen's Works factory CCM from back in the day. So we'll be taking a look at this lovely pair of CCMs when we return again to my video channel. So until the next time, thanks once again for tuning in to my channel, and I hope you will return again very soon to take a look at more of these old vintage race bikes right here on Classic Dirt Bike TV.